What happened to royal wet nurses after the prince grew up? Hey guys, and welcome back. Tonight, we're going to drift into one of those oddly forgotten corners of royal life. So dim the lights, get cozy, and let's take a slow walk through history together. No need to sit up straight. No need to keep track of names too sharply. We're here to relax. Our topic tonight is royal wet nurses. Yes, those women, the ones who breastfed princes and princesses, sometimes more than the actual queens did. They were part of the royal household, part of the nursery, part of the baby's first years of life. And then, well, what actually happened when the child grew up? Did these women just vanish? Did they retire to a cottage in the countryside with a thank you note? Or did they hang around the court like ghostly reminders of infancy? The answer, unsurprisingly, is both weird and sad, because of course it is. History doesn't really do happy HR exit strategies, so let's settle in. This is going to be a long, meandering story about milk, monarchy, and the strange in-between status of women who were too intimate to be ignored, but too humble to be respected. Let's start with the basics. In royal and noble households, babies were almost never fed by their mothers. Queens were not supposed to nurse their own children. Why? Well, the reasons were a mix of medical nonsense, patriarchal expectations, and cold dynastic logic. One big reason was fertility. If a queen breastfed her child, her body would often stop ovulating for a time. That meant fewer chances to produce the next heir. And kings, well, kings were impatient. They wanted their wives back in the royal bedchamber as quickly as possible, preferably working on baby number 2. Breastfeeding slowed that down, so outsourcing it was the answer. Another reason, status. Breastfeeding was seen as peasant work, something for farm women, not for ladies dripping in jewels. A queen had to look serene, not hunched over a cradle at 2 in the morning. Heaven forbid her figure be affected, or her skin lose that royal glow. So in came the wet nurse, a woman chosen to do the job of nourishing the next king. But here's where it gets uncomfortable. These wet nurses weren't just random women off the street. They had to be carefully selected. People believed that a wet nurse's personality, her morals, even her diet, would pass into the child through her milk. If she was lazy or bad-tempered, the baby might grow up the same way. If she ate garlic, well, apparently that was thought to create cranky princes. So there were entire rule books about who could be chosen. Ideally, she was healthy, pious, not too old, not too young, and, this is grim, she usually had her own baby who had recently died. That way her body was still producing milk, but she was available. Convenient for the palace. Tragic for her. So imagine this. You're a grieving mother, and instead of nursing your own lost child, you're suddenly feeding the king's baby. You're handed over to the court, clothed decently, maybe even given servants yourself, and told your new job is to keep the little prince alive. And the bond that grew was enormous. Infants don't know titles. They don't care about crowns. They know the smell of milk, the warmth of the body holding them, the heartbeat they fall asleep to. So for the first months or years of their life, the future ruler of a kingdom would often be closer to this woman than to their own biological mother. Queens, after all, were busy with politics, ceremonies, or just keeping themselves alive in those terrifying childbirth cycles. But here comes the question that set us on tonight's topic. When the royal baby outgrew breastfeeding, what happened to the wet nurse? Well, the answer varied, but it was almost never neat. Some wet nurses were dismissed politely. They might get a pension, a small estate, or a lump of money. The idea was, thank you for your service, now please go live quietly in the countryside, and never embarrass us by mentioning that the king once drooled on your shoulder. Others were kept on. Sometimes as attendants in the royal nursery, sometimes as governesses, sometimes as what we might call comfort staff. They had been too close to the child to be entirely cut off. Many kings and queens remembered their wet nurses fondly. They called them their milk mothers, and even in adulthood they'd slip them favors. Some wet nurses became surprisingly influential, precisely because they had this early intimate bond. But there's a catch. Society didn't know what to do with them. They weren't noble, but they weren't common either. They weren't quite servants, but they weren't family. They lived in a twilight zone of status, always slightly awkward. Let's float into a few examples, because history is littered with these quiet figures. In medieval France, wet nurses were practically institutionalized. Every royal nursery had them, and some were treated almost like minor nobles. For instance, Louis XIV, the Sun King, remembered his wet nurse with real affection. She was given lands and gifts, and her family prospered just because she had once fed the most powerful man in Europe. Not bad considering she started out as a nobody. In contrast, in Tudor England, the whole thing was a bit colder. Henry VIII's children had wet nurses, of course, but those women were rotated out with little ceremony. Queens like Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn didn't want milk mothers hanging around court too visibly. It reminded everyone of the raw animal side of kingship, which clashed badly with the polished pageantry Henry was obsessed with. Meanwhile, in Spain, wet nurses often came from rural villages. There was a whole culture around sending Basque women to nurse royal babies because they had a reputation for being strong, healthy, and, according to stereotypes, morally upright. Whether that was true or not, these women would leave their own families for years at a time, enter the palace and raise infants who weren't theirs. And when their service ended, they sometimes returned home with enough wealth to elevate their entire families. The others just disappeared back into obscurity, never mentioned again. Now here's where the story tilts into the quietly tragic, because many of these women became deeply attached. You don't feed a baby for a year or two without forming a bond. And when that baby grew up and called someone else mother, well, it had to sting. Queens rarely acknowledged the emotional side of it. Wet nurses were thanked with coins, not with closeness. Yet letters survive of some wet nurses writing to their former nurslings, now grown kings or queens, begging for attention, recognition, or just a visit. Sometimes they got it. More often they didn't. One of the most striking examples is Catherine de' Medici, Queen of France. She herself didn't nurse her children. She had too many dynastic duties. But she was deeply aware of how important wet nurses were. Some of them remained around her court for decades, sort of like honorary aunties, but even then they were never given real respect. They were half invisible, useful until they weren't. And yet kings and queens often carried memories of their wet nurses for life. There are anecdotes of monarchs sneaking away from ceremonies to visit an old, wrinkled woman in a village, their former wet nurse, pressing money into her hand and saying with some emotion, "You gave me life." A strangely human moment in the middle of all that stiff, gold-embroidered ceremony, but of course not every story was warm. Some wet nurses were scapegoated. If a child grew up sickly or strange, guess who got blamed? That's right, the woman who fed them. Clearly she must have eaten the wrong food, or had the wrong morals, or cursed the milk. Because heaven forbid the endless cousin marriages of European royalty were to blame. No, much easier to blame the woman in the nursery, and sometimes dismissal was harsh. "Thank you very much, now get out." Some went back to poverty, others remarried, others just faded. History only remembers the ones who stuck around, but for every wet nurse who ended up with a pension, dozens more were erased. So the story of royal wet nurses is one of intimacy followed by distance, of being needed desperately, then discarded just as quickly. It's about the strangeness of monarchy itself, how even the most basic act of feeding a child could be wrapped in ceremony, Status and hierarchy. Let's glide forward, because there are plenty more odd details to explore. Milk mothers of kings and queens, all right, still with me? Good, let's keep floating. If part 1 gave us the broad strokes, the why, the how, the weird, awkward status of wet nurses, part 2 is where we wade into actual royal families. Because history gives us names, little anecdotes, and just enough gossip to sketch these half-forgotten women, and we're going to move slowly, like we're strolling down a long gallery of portraits. Except instead of kings in shiny armor, we're going to look for the women who were never painted. Let's begin with France, because France practically industrialized the practice of royal wet nursing. The French monarchy, from the Middle Ages through the Bourbon dynasty, relied heavily on wet nurses. Queens were basically forbidden to nurse their own children, considered beneath their dignity. So the palace developed an entire system. Midwives and physicians would vet potential wet nurses. They had checklists: healthy complexion, no signs of disease, good teeth, and preferably from a rural background. Why rural? Because the idea was that country women were sturdier and morally purer than city women. Paris, after all, was apparently full of bad influences like wine, gossip, and garlic. Take the case of Louis XIV, the famous Sun King. We know his wet nurse was a woman named Marie Creusot. Not exactly a household name, but for the first months of his life, she was more important to him than his own mother, Anne of Austria. She kept him alive day and night. And unlike many wet nurses, she actually stayed in his orbit for years. The young king, as he grew older, never forgot her. Records show that he granted her family lands and pensions. A peasant woman, elevated simply because she had once been the literal lifeline of France's future. Not bad, considering most wet nurses disappeared without a word. But here's the irony: for every Marie Creusot, there were dozens who didn't get remembered. For Louis XIV's younger brother, Philippe, Duke of Orléans, the wet nurse's name was barely recorded at all. Same palace, same system, but her story just evaporated. So even in the grandest courts, recognition was inconsistent at best. Now let's wander over to England. The Tudors were not known for their warm family life, and wet nurses were part of that cold machinery. Take Henry VIII's daughter, Elizabeth I. She was famously raised in a complicated household after her mother, Anne Boleyn, was executed. But when she was a baby, she had a wet nurse like every other royal child. The woman's name was Anne Dow. For the first 2 years of Elizabeth's life, Anne was the one feeding her, rocking her, keeping her alive through sickness. And what was her reward? Practically nothing. She faded back into obscurity, while Elizabeth went on to become the great Virgin Queen. Imagine being the woman who literally nourished the body of one of history's most famous rulers. And nobody even remembers your face. Henry VIII himself. He also had wet nurses, though details are thinner. In fact, one of his sisters, Mary Tudor, left behind a slightly warmer memory. Her wet nurse, a woman named Maud Green, became a trusted figure at court, eventually serving as a lady-in-waiting. That's a rare case of a wet nurse climbing the social ladder. But again, notice the pattern. Only when they were tied to politics or power did wet nurses get remembered. Otherwise, they just disappeared. And the English court had its own obsession with control. Physicians were always hovering, making sure wet nurses ate the right foods. No cabbage, no onions, no wine, because apparently those would give the baby colic. As if royal children needed any help being cranky. Now, let's drift into Spain. Spanish royalty had a long tradition of using women from the Basque region as wet nurses. Why? Because Basque women had this reputation for being strong, healthy, and, according to stereotypes, morally strict. Whether or not that was true, they were shipped into royal palaces generation after generation. For example, Philip II of Spain, the king who sent the Armada against England, was raised by a Basque wet nurse. He adored her so much that even in adulthood, he kept sending her gifts. It was said that he trusted her more than most of his courtiers, which frankly says a lot about how lonely monarchs could be. Everyone at court wanted power or money, but the woman who had rocked him to sleep as a baby, she just wanted him to eat and stay warm. That kind of loyalty lingered. On the other hand, some Spanish wet nurses had tougher fates. Once dismissed, they often returned to their villages, only to find that their long absence had made them strangers to their own families. Imagine leaving your newborn child to feed another baby, then returning years later trying to reconnect. It's not exactly a cheerful homecoming. And then we have the Habsburgs, the great masters of inbreeding. If ever there was a dynasty that needed strong wet nurses, it was them. Take Charles II of Spain, the so-called bewitched king. His health was a disaster from the start. Weak bones, drooling, constant illness. Naturally, his wet nurses got blamed. People whispered that the milk had been tainted, or that she had cursed him. In reality, Charles's condition came from centuries of Habsburg cousins marrying each other. But of course no one wanted to say that out loud. Much easier to point at the peasant woman in the nursery and say, her fault. Other Habsburg children had slightly happier stories. In Austria, wet nurses often stayed on as honorary family members, sometimes buried in churchyards with special inscriptions like Milk Mother of Archduke so-and-so. That's as close as most of them got to immortality, a line on a tombstone. Now, here's something fascinating. Wet nurses sometimes passed their bond down through generations. Meaning, if one woman nursed a king, her daughter or niece might be chosen to nurse the king's child. It became almost hereditary. Families of wet nurses who quietly served royal houses for centuries. Entire dynasties of invisible women. You won't find them in the history books, but if you look in parish registers, you'll see the same surnames popping up again and again. And sometimes those families actually gained a little local prestige. In villages, being descended from a milk mother of the king was a weird badge of honor. People would whisper, her grandmother nursed the Bourbon princes, as if that elevated the whole bloodline. In a way it did, but what about the emotional side? What did the children think? Well, there are records of monarchs visiting their old wet nurses decades later. Picture this. A king in fine robes, slipping into a small cottage, bending down to embrace a wrinkled old woman who once rocked him to sleep. Sweet? Yes, but also rare. More often, wet nurses were remembered only faintly. Royal children grew up surrounded by tutors, governesses, and politics. Their milk mother faded into the background, and yet, when death came, many kings and queens remembered them in their wills. A line or two, to my wet nurse leave such and such sum. Small but meaningful. It was like a whispered acknowledgement of a bond they couldn't fully admit in public. So, what we see across France, England, Spain, and Austria is a pattern. Wet nurses were essential, intimate, and cherished in infancy, and then awkward, semi-forgotten, sometimes honored, sometimes blamed, but always in a strange limbo once the child grew up. It's the paradox of monarchy itself. A system obsessed with bloodlines and dynasties, quietly built on the milk of women who rarely got remembered. Let's drift further, because there are still more odd corners of this story, especially the cultural superstitions about wet nurses, and the way their milk was thought to carry not just health, but personality, virtue, even fate. Milk, morality, and superstitions. We've wandered through royal nurseries, peeked at French, English, and Spanish courts, and noticed the odd half-life of wet nurses once their milk was no longer needed. But tonight wouldn't be complete without the stranger side of the story, because wet nursing wasn't just biology. It was loaded with superstition, half-science, and more than a little paranoia. People in the Middle Ages and early modern period really believed that milk carried more than just calories. To them it carried character, morality, maybe even destiny. Which means the choice of a wet nurse wasn't just practical. It was practically cosmic. Let's start with the most common belief. Milk shaped the child's personality. If the wet nurse was patient, calm and virtuous, her milk was thought to be clean, producing a child with noble qualities. But if she was lazy, greedy, or immoral, well, her milk would supposedly infect the child with those same flaws. Imagine applying that logic today. Oh, the prince is selfish? Must be the wet nurse's fault. Not the fact that he's been spoiled rotten since birth. This belief got so detailed that manuals were written, guides for selecting the perfect wet nurse. Physicians and midwives advised checking her body type, her diet, even the look in her eyes. If her gaze seemed shifty, bad milk. If she liked wine too much, poisonous milk. If she was melancholic, her milk would make the baby sad. Basically anything could be blamed on her. And of course the irony is huge here. While doctors were fretting about whether a woman had eaten too much cabbage, entire dynasties were collapsing under centuries of inbreeding. But no, it couldn't possibly be the Habsburg jaw. It had to be the milk. Another layer of superstition was the transfer of class through milk. Yes, people worried that if a baby of noble birth drank the milk of a peasant, they might absorb peasant-like qualities. The horror. This was especially strong in courts obsessed with purity of blood. So in some places, wet nurses had to be carefully vetted to make sure they weren't too lowborn, or at least that they came from the right kind of rural family, pious. Hard-working, not too rebellious, this anxiety could get absurd. In 15th century Italy, there were debates over whether Jewish or Muslim women could serve as wet nurses. Spoiler, the answer was usually no, not because of actual health concerns, but because people thought the baby would absorb their religion through milk. That's how mystical the whole idea became. And then there was the belief in milk as medicine, or poison. Milk wasn't just for babies. In medieval thought, breast milk was a kind of sacred fluid. Physicians prescribed it for all sorts of ailments, wounds, fevers, even melancholy. You could drink it like medicine, or smear it on cuts. Of course, not just any milk. Ideally, it had to come from a virtuous, healthy woman. Again, the personality transfer idea lingered. You didn't want cranky milk on your sword wound, but flip that around and you get the darker side, the idea of poisoned milk. Wet nurses were sometimes accused of trying to kill royal infants by corrupting their milk, either by eating bad food on purpose or through witchcraft. If a baby died young, which was heartbreakingly common, suspicion often fell on the wet nurse. Some were punished harshly, even executed for something entirely out of their control. It's the same old story. Kings could have 20 illegitimate children by mistresses, and no one batted an eye. But if the heir sneezed too much, everyone looked sideways at the woman in the nursery. Now, let's drift into some specific cultural quirks. In France, people believed that a wet nurse's moral character literally flavored her milk. Too much anger? The milk was hot and dangerous. Too much sadness. The milk was cold and depressing. It was like medieval Yelp reviews, but for women's bodies. In Spain, especially in Basque tradition, there was the idea that a good wet nurse could transfer strength and even beauty. Families bragged about their daughters nursing royal children, not just for the pension, but because it was thought their milk carried noble virtues in return, like a kind of exchange. Milk as social currency. In England, the obsession was more medical. Physicians there insisted on elaborate dietary rules. No garlic, no onions, no ale, no fatty meats. The poor women basically lived on boiled grains and broth, because nothing says healthy milk like slowly starving your nurse. And in Eastern Europe, folklore leaned into the magical. In some Slavic traditions, breast milk was thought to be connected to the soul. A wet nurse who withheld her milk too soon could curse the child with weakness. Others believed witches stole breast milk to feed their own familiars. It was a fluid both sacred and dangerous. And let's not forget the strange role of sexual jealousy, because queens weren't nursing their own children. They sometimes grew suspicious, almost resentful of the women who were. Imagine being a queen, technically the child's mother, but watching another woman hold your baby close, feed it, soothe it, bond with it. Some queens handled it with grace, others not so much. There are rumors from French and Spanish courts of queens ordering their children weaned early, just to cut the wet nurse out of the picture. Sometimes the bond between the child and the nurse grew stronger than the bond with the biological mother. And in a world where dynastic heirs were everything, that could feel like a threat. By the 17th century, medical writers began pushing back against some of the wilder superstitions. They argued that milk was just nutrition, not morality in liquid form. But the old beliefs lingered for centuries. Even in the 19th century, upper-class mothers in Europe were still outsourcing nursing, partly because of health anxieties, partly because of the old idea that the wrong milk could corrupt a child. Of course, modern science has cleared this up. Milk doesn't transmit laziness or anger or religion, but for hundreds of years people lived and died by that belief. So if we step back, what do we see? Wet nurses weren't just women with milk. They were treated like mystical pipelines, transferring virtue or vice from one body to another. They were blamed for royal deformities, praised for royal health, scrutinized for every bite of food. And all of this was wrapped in layers of superstition that made their job both vital and terrifying. No wonder so many of them disappeared quietly. Being a wet nurse was high risk, low reward. If the child thrived, the glory went to the dynasty. If the child faltered, the blame fell on you. It's a reminder, really, of how fragile royal power was in its earliest stage. Before crowns and coronations, before armies and palaces, every king was just a squirming baby, entirely dependent on the milk of a woman history rarely bothered to name. Voices from the shadows, we've been floating through royal nurseries and superstitions. We've looked at the queens who didn't feed their children, the kings who occasionally remembered their milk mothers, and the unlucky ones who got blamed for illnesses they couldn't prevent. But what about the wet nurses themselves? What did they actually say? What do we know in their own words? The short answer is, not much. These were not women with the leisure to write memoirs. They didn't sit down in silk robes and pen their confessions of a wet nurse for future generations. Most of them were illiterate, or if they could write, nobody cared to preserve their words. Their lives were recorded, if at all, in contracts, petitions, or someone else's diary, and yet tiny fragments survive. And they're surprisingly moving. Let's start with France again, because France produced a lot of paperwork. Royal wet nurses were often hired under formal contracts. These spelled out how long they were expected to serve, what they could eat, and what they would be paid. Some even set rules like no sex during service because pregnancy could interrupt milk flow. Imagine signing a job contract where your love life is legally regulated. Very on brand for the French monarchy. But beyond the contracts, we also find petitions, letters written to kings and queens, asking for pensions. A few of these survive from the 16th and 17th centuries. They're usually short, polite, and pleading. Something like, "Your Majesty, I humbly remind you that I fed you in your infancy. I am now old and poor. Might you remember me?" And sometimes the monarchs did remember. Louis the Fiend granted stipends to his former nurse and her children. Louis XIV, as we said earlier, was generous to his milk mother. But the tone of the petitions tells us something. These women knew their service wasn't automatically honored. They had to remind their royal babies, now adults, that they had once kept them alive. It's like sending an invoice 30 years late. In England, records are thinner, but some letters survive. One touching example comes from the household of James VI of Scotland, later James I of England. His nurse, Helen Little, was with him through his earliest years. In adulthood, James granted her a pension and even land. In a royal warrant, he called her his dear Norris. The spelling may be quaint, but the sentiment is clear. He felt genuine affection. That word, Norris or nurse, and was used in Scotland almost like foster mother. It shows how blurred the line could be between biological and milk mothers. And in return, Helen Little wrote humble petitions, thanking him for his kindness and asking for continued support for her children. You can almost hear the weariness in her voice, years of service reduced to polite begging. Meanwhile, in Spain, there are parish registers that record wet nurses returning home after years at court. One Basque woman, her name given simply as Maria, came back to her village after nursing a royal infant in Madrid. The parish priest noted with some pride that she was the nourisher of a prince. That's it. No pension, no story, just one line in a dusty book. But you can imagine her walking back into her village, older, probably tired, carrying nothing but the memory of a baby who would never remember her. And then there are the wills. In a few cases, wet nurses made sure to write down their connection in their last testaments. One French woman in the 16th century instructed that her tombstone should read, "Here lies Jeanne, who nourished the Dauphin." That was her identity, her claim to remembrance. Not wife, not mother of her own children, but the woman who once held the future king to her breast. It's both sad and oddly noble. In Austria, too, you sometimes see inscriptions like "Milk Mother of Archduke Ferdinand," a quiet, humble line carved into stone, centuries before LinkedIn job titles were a thing. But perhaps the most striking traces are the little gifts and tokens that survive. A wet nurse might keep a piece of cloth from the royal nursery, or a tiny jewel given as thanks. In France, one family preserved a silver cup, said to have been gifted to their ancestor by the Bourbon princes she nursed. The cup wasn't fancy, more sentimental than valuable, but it became a family heirloom, proof that their great-great-grandmother had once been closer to a king than any noble ever was. And in England, there's a record of Elizabeth Farn sending a cloak to her former nurse. Imagine that, the Queen, famous for her glittering gowns, gifting one to the woman who once held her as a red-haired infant. The gesture was small, but for the nurse, it was a recognition that she hadn't been entirely forgotten. Of course, for every touching story, there are many that end in silence. The majority of wet nurses left no words, no gifts, no inscriptions. Their lives were swallowed by time, and that's part of the tragedy. These women were essential, literally life-givers to dynasties, yet most remain nameless. They slip through the archives like shadows, only visible when something went wrong. A child fell ill. Suddenly, the nurse's name is dragged into court. A scandal breaks out. The nurse is mentioned as a footnote. Otherwise, silence. So when we look at the scraps, petitions, wills, contracts, and the occasional gift, they tell us something more powerful than pages of chronicles could. They tell us that wet nurses lived in a constant tension, intimate with royalty, yet always disposable. They could beg for pensions, boast in epitaphs, or cling to a silver cup as proof of their service. But most of all, they lived in the shadow of the children they fed, children who grew into kings and queens, rarely looking back. Wet nurses in art, literature, and legend. So let's take a step back. When most people in medieval or early modern Europe thought of a wet nurse, they didn't picture the actual working woman with cracked hands and a tired back. Instead, they pictured an idea. And ideas are always neater, stranger, and often less flattering than reality. The icon of the nurse saint in religious art, especially in Catholic Europe, wet nurses were sometimes elevated into semi-sacred figures. This goes back to the most famous mother-child image of all time, the Virgin Mary nursing the baby Jesus. Paintings of the Madonna lactans, the nursing Madonna, were everywhere in the late Middle Ages and Renaissance. Mary was imagined as the perfect wet nurse, offering divine milk to humanity itself. Sometimes saints like St. Bernard were shown miraculously receiving drops of Mary's breast milk in visions. Yes, that was a real artistic theme. And yes, it was as strange as it sounds. This imagery gave wet nursing a kind of holy aura. The act of feeding at the breast was divine, even mystical, which was ironic, considering that many actual wet nurses were treated as disposable servants. It's like society loved the symbol, but shrugged at the women themselves. The comic old nurse in theatre and literature. Wet nurses pop up constantly, but usually as comedy stock characters. Take ancient Roman plays by writers like Plautus and Terence. Their nurse figures were gossipy, talkative, often meddling in young lovers' affairs. Fast forward to Renaissance drama, and the tradition continued. Think of Shakespeare's Romeo and Juliet. Juliet's nurse is the classic example. Long-winded, earthy, prone to inappropriate jokes, and more emotionally invested in Juliet's love life than Juliet's own parents. This comic nurse character became a cultural staple. She represented familiarity, chatter, and motherly meddling, the opposite of the silent, dignified biological mother. Of course, real wet nurses probably weren't spouting bawdy jokes about teenage romance while rocking a cradle. But the stereotype stuck. The temptress anxiety, now here's where it gets darker. In medieval moral writings, there was a persistent fear that wet nurses were dangerous, not just because of disease, but because of morality. Churchmen worried, if a nurse was immoral, wouldn't her milk corrupt the baby's soul? Some treatises went further. Wet nurses were accused of seducing fathers. Picture the setup. A young woman brought into a household, physically close to the baby, often living under the same roof. Suspicious minds didn't have to stretch far to imagine scandal. In the 13th century, a Spanish moralist even warned kings to keep a close eye on wet nurses, because many a household has been dishonored by their presence. Basically, the idea was, milk good, milk giver, suspicious. This anxiety shows up in literature too. In certain French and Italian plays, the wet nurse is portrayed as lusty, greedy, and untrustworthy. She's both essential and suspect, a walking contradiction. Folk tales and superstitions. Then there are the folk traditions, which took things to a whole other level. In rural Europe, people believed that breast milk carried not just nutrition, but personality, morality, even luck. So a child nursed by the wrong woman could grow up weak, cowardly, or sinful. One superstition from early modern Italy claimed that if a wet nurse ate too much garlic, the baby would grow up with a sharp tongue. If she drank too much wine, the child would be a drunkard. If she was melancholic, the baby would be gloomy for life. Essentially, the nurse's diet and mood were thought to rewrite the baby's destiny. In some Slavic traditions, witches were imagined as stealing milk, either from cows or from women. The act of nursing itself was magical, and therefore a little bit dangerous. That association rubbed off on wet nurses, who occupied an odd space between ordinary servant and quasi-magical figure. Satirical poetry and songs, and because no profession escapes ridicule, wet nurses also show up in satirical verse. 17th century pamphlets mocked them as greedy women who demanded more payment than they deserved. One French poem sniped that wet nurses feast like queens while their own children starve. Another broadside ballad from England joked about a nurse who swapped royal milk for ale, leaving the poor prince hiccuping in his cradle. It was meant as political satire, suggesting that rulers were corrupted from infancy by careless servants. But it still reveals how wet nurses were fair game for mockery. Portraits and silence, oddly enough, while we have paintings of queens with their infants, we almost never have portraits of the wet nurses themselves. They're invisible in high art. Even in images where you know a wet nurse must be present, like a royal baptism scene, she's not shown. The focus is on the noble baby, the godparents, the fancy priest, the glittering court. The woman who literally fed the child is airbrushed out, as if milk just arrived by magic. This absence in portraiture mirrors their social position, intimate, essential but not to be seen, the contrast. So, if you step back, you see a strange cultural double image, sacred ideal, the Madonna, divine milk, purity, karmic stereotype, the gossiping, bawdy old nurse in plays, moral anxiety, the dangerous, tempting servant who might corrupt the baby, everyday silence, in portraits and chronicles, mostly absent. Wet nurses lived in that tension, celebrated, mocked, distrusted, and ignored, all at once. And that's why studying their portrayals is oddly important. It tells us less about the women themselves, who were just working, tired, often poor, and more about the societies around them. Societies that projected all their hopes, fears, and jokes onto the figure of a woman with milk. The decline of the royal wet nurse. So far we've wandered through centuries of milk, monarchs and the women caught between them. But all traditions end eventually. The story of wet nursing is no different. By the 18th and 19th centuries, the profession that had once carried dynasties began to wither away. Why? Several reasons. Let's glide through them nice and easy. The rise of natural motherhood. In the 1700s, a new cultural obsession spread through Europe. The idea that good mothers should nurse their own children. We can blame or thank a certain Swiss philosopher named Jean-Jacques Rousseau. In his 1762 book Émile, he insisted that women should breastfeed their own babies. He accused wealthy mothers of laziness and selfishness for hiring wet nurses. According to Rousseau, the bond between mother and child could only be formed at the breast. It was a pretty ironic statement, considering Rousseau himself fathered several children and sent them all to orphanages. But history loves a hypocrite, and his words carried weight. Across Europe, middle and upper-class mothers began to feel pressure to nurse personally. Breastfeeding shifted from being a servant's task to a symbol of maternal virtue. Suddenly, wet nurses seemed old-fashioned, even shameful. Hard. Medical shifts at the same time. Doctors were getting involved. In earlier centuries, wet nurses were hired through reputation, gossip, and maybe a quick inspection to check for good milk. By the late 18th century, medicine was turning more scientific, or at least it thought it was. Physicians began writing manuals on infant care, warning that wet nurses could transmit disease, bad habits, or even moral corruption through their milk. Some of these warnings were based on real health concerns, like syphilis being passed from nurse to infant. Others were pure pseudoscience, like the claim that a melancholic nurse could make a baby depressed for life. But either way, the effect was the same. Elite families became wary. Better to keep the baby close, under the eye of doctors and mother, than risk the unpredictable servant's milk. The Industrial Revolution and urban wet nurses, meanwhile, in the cities, wet nursing didn't vanish right away. In fact, the 19th century saw a booming urban wet nurse market. Factories needed workers, and poor women often had no choice but to send their infants to be nursed by someone else while they worked. Entire wet nurse agencies cropped up in Paris and London, pairing desperate mothers with women who had extra milk. but the royal and aristocratic glamour was gone. These weren't palace servants with pensions. They were anonymous women cycling through dozens of babies, often in terrible conditions. Infant mortality rates skyrocketed. Reformers began to campaign against the practice, framing it as exploitative and dangerous. The arrival of formula, and then science delivered a replacement. In the mid-19th century, chemists developed the first forms of artificial infant formula. They weren't perfect. Early formulas were clunky mixtures of cow's milk, wheat flour, and sugar. But they were marketed as clean, scientific, and modern. For the first time in history, wealthy families could bypass both the mother and the wet nurse. No more messy contracts, no more milk inspections, no more social awkwardness about who was actually feeding the baby. Just a bottle and a tin of powder. By the late 1800s, formula companies were running aggressive advertising campaigns. Posters showed smiling babies with slogans like, "The modern way to feed your child." And slowly, the wet nurse profession began to collapse. Royal households changed, too. Even the royals eventually gave up their centuries-old dependence. In Britain, Queen Victoria was famously squeamish about breastfeeding. She considered it undignified and refused to nurse her 9 children. But by her reign, wet nursing was already on the decline. Victoria relied on bottle feeding and nannies instead. In France, Napoleon III's wife, Empress Eugénie, briefly toyed with the idea of nursing her son herself, inspired by Rousseau and natural motherhood trends, but court doctors discouraged it. The baby was put on formula and supplemental nursing. By the early 20th century, royal wet nurses were almost extinct. Monarchs still had armies of nannies, governesses, and attendants, but the woman with milk had quietly disappeared from palaces. The memory and the myth so. What happened to the legacy of wet nurses? For the most part, they slipped into silence. History books rarely mention them. Biographies of kings and queens skim over infancy in a few sentences, if at all. The women who once sustained dynasties with their bodies became historical footnotes, yet the cultural echoes remain. The comic old nurse character still lingers in literature. The Madonna lactans still graces church walls. Even the modern obsession with breastfeeding versus formula has faint roots in those centuries of debates over wet nurses. And in rural Europe, you can still find families who proudly claim descent from a royal wet nurse, preserving silver cups, letters, or just stories whispered down generations. For them, being milk-kin to royalty is still a point of quiet pride. The gentle ending. What happened to royal wet nurses after the prince grew up? Some were remembered with pensions, land, or tokens of gratitude. Many were quietly dismissed, fading back into villages where nobody cared whose lips had once rested at their breast. Some became legends in family stories, while others were reduced to one-line mentions in dusty contracts, and eventually their entire profession dissolved, first replaced by natural motherhood, then by powdered milk in glass bottles. 1,000 years of royal milk, gone in a century, and that's where our story rests. Not with fanfare, not with drama, but with a quiet fade, just like the women themselves, slipping back into the shadows of history. So if you're listening to this in bed, here's the soft takeaway. Behind every king, queen, prince, and princess, there was once a woman whose name we barely know, whose body carried the dynasty forward, and whose story ends almost always in silence. Sleep well, knowing history is full of forgotten caretakers, and that sometimes the most essential people are the ones nobody remembers. Echoes, legacies, and the milk of memory. So you might think the story ends when formula takes over, and royal nurseries swap wet nurses for silver spoons. But history never ends cleanly. Things leave echoes. Wet nurses, though mostly forgotten, still leave ripples across time. In words, customs, And even in how we talk about family today. The language of milkkin in many cultures, nursing created a bond as strong as blood. In the Islamic world, for example, the concept of milk kinship was, and still is, legally recognized. If two babies were nursed by the same woman, they were considered siblings. They could not marry even if they were unrelated by blood. This rule, rooted in Islamic law, shaped dynasties, inheritance, and marriages for centuries. European monarchies never made such laws formal, but informally the idea was there. Kings often referred to their wet nurses as milk mothers, and to their nurses' children as milk brothers or sisters. The terms were affectionate, but also confusing. Imagine trying to draw a family tree when some of the branches are technically there because of breast milk. Proverbs and sayings. The role of wet nurses also seeped into everyday speech. In 17th century France, to call someone a nourrice sèche, a dry nurse, meant a caregiver who gave nothing useful, someone all title and no substance. In England, the phrase dry nurse stuck too, and it still survives today in the sense of overseeing someone clumsily, like dry nursing a co-worker through a project. These little linguistic fossils remind us how common wet nursing once was. People used the image as shorthand, the way we might use babysitter or nanny today. Anthropologists and milk sharing in the 20th and 21st centuries. Anthropologists rediscovered wet nursing when they studied milk sharing practices around the world. In some African and Middle Eastern cultures, communal breastfeeding was still normal well into the modern era. A baby hungry? Another mother fed them, no fuss. The Western obsession with individuality and sterile feeding jars seemed bizarre to these communities. And recently, in the age of the Internet, milk sharing has returned in a strange digital form, women pumping and donating milk to strangers through online networks. It's not called wet nursing anymore, but the echo is unmistakable. Bodies feeding other people's babies, history looping back in quiet, waged at the breastfeeding debates. And then there's the modern breast versus bottle debate. If you've ever seen parents online arguing about whether breast milk or formula is better, congratulations. You've stumbled into the ghost of the wet nurse controversy. For centuries, people argued about whose milk was best, what habits a nurse might pass on, and whether artificial feeding was dangerous. The details change. Garlic superstitions turn into scientific studies, but the underlying anxiety remains the same. How do we make sure babies thrive, and who should be responsible? The wet nurse, once central, has become invisible in that conversation. But her shadow is there every time someone debates natural motherhood versus modern convenience. Pop culture shadows, wet nurses even pop up, faintly in popular culture. In fantasy novels and TV shows, you'll sometimes see the trope of the nurse who raised the prince. Game of Thrones did this with characters who were half servants, half mothers. The image is instantly recognizable, even if viewers don't know the long history behind it. And in older literature, from Shakespeare to folk ballads, the figure of the gossipy, earthy nurse remains. She's the one who remembers the hero's childhood, sometimes with more affection than the parents. She's comic relief but also oddly grounding. The forgotten labor at the same time. Modern historians are starting to circle back and study wet nurses seriously. In the last 20 years, books and articles have begun piecing together their lives. Contracts, payments, petitions, and village records. Scholars are asking, what was it really like to give up your own baby to feed another? The answers are complicated and often painful. Many nurses were poor women making desperate choices. Some children died while their mothers were away in royal nurseries. Others lived, but grew up without knowing the woman who carried them in pregnancy. Behind the glamour of nursing princes and kings, there was always loss. remembering wet nurses is, in a way, an act of justice, giving back a little visibility to women whose work made dynasties possible, but who were erased from the official record, the gentle legacy, so what remains today. Not portraits, not biographies, not monuments, but traces. The affectionate term nurse still carries echoes of nourish. The breastfeeding debates still carry their shadows. Families still whisper that their great-great-grandmother once fed a king. The wet nurse is gone, but she lingers in language, in law, in memory, drifting to a close. So, if you followed this entire sleepy monologue, from royal nurseries to Rousseau, from bawdy Shakespearean nurses to powdered formula tins, you've now seen the quiet arc of history bend. What happened to royal wet nurses after the prince grew up? They faded into the background. They left contracts, petitions, and sometimes a silver cup. They left stories whispered down generations. They left metaphors in our speech and anxieties in our culture. And maybe that's the softest truth of all. The women who held the most fragile lives in their arms rarely hold the spotlight. But they shaped history, one mouthful of milk at a time, so close your eyes. Picture a shadowed nursery, a tired woman rocking a baby who will one day wear a crown. Outside, the palace hums. Inside, only breath, warmth, and the sound of history being nourished in silence. Drifting beyond the nursery, so here we are again, 10 whole parts. You've followed this trail through centuries of nurseries, palaces, and quiet lives. And now the story has slowed to the faintest hum. If you're still with me, fully awake somehow, that's impressive. But maybe you're drifting, which was always the point. The quiet house. Let's imagine the palace again, one last time. But this time, strip away the grandeur. Forget the thrones, the tapestries, the echoing halls. Picture instead a small, quiet room. The shutters are closed. The fire burns low. The only sound is the steady breath of a sleeping child. The nurse sits nearby, half dozing, waiting in case the baby stirs. That's all. No ceremony, no history books, just stillness. History in hushed tones. It's funny, isn't it? How history is often imagined as noise, battles, trumpets, speeches, but in truth so much of it was silence. The silence of waiting, the silence of rocking, the silence of lives spent in the shadows. That's where most of history actually lived, not in the loud moments, but in the quiet ones. The weight of forgetting. And so, as we think about wet nurses, or really any of the invisible workers of the past, it's worth remembering their silence wasn't emptiness. It was full of weight. Every forgotten woman, every unnamed hand, every erased life carried something vital. You can almost hear it now if you listen, a hum beneath the surface of history. The sound of all the things that kept the great machine running unnoticed. The drift, and now maybe it's time to let the story drift too, like a lullaby that doesn't need an ending. Like a candle that simply burns down. The words can keep flowing, but they don't need to go anywhere. They can just float like dust in a shaft of light. The last image. So let's close on this picture. A cradle. A woman sitting nearby, her head bowed in drowsiness, the crown still waiting in another room, untouched, irrelevant for now. For this one moment, the future king is only a baby, and the world is quiet. That's it. That's the heart of the story. Not the power, not the glory, just the quiet thread of care. And with that, maybe you can let your own eyes close, because history will still be there tomorrow. But for tonight, it can wait. The lingering whisper. We've already walked through the palaces. We've already sat by the cradle. We've already drifted into silence. And yet there's always a little more to say, not because it's needed, but because it's comforting. Like when someone stays by your bedside talking softly, even though the story ended long ago. Shadows on the wall. Picture the old nursery again. Not in daylight, not filled with bustle, but at night. Only a dim candle flickering, casting slow-moving shadows on the wall. The baby sleeps. The nurse breathes quietly. The world outside, with its wars and councils and ambitions, feels impossibly far away. History pauses. Just for a moment. Time as a gentle tide. Think of time not as marching, not as grinding forward, but as waves lapping on a shore. Each life is just a ripple. Each story a small crest that rises, breaks, and folds back into the sea. The wet nurses we've spoken about, they rose, they lived, they faded. Forgotten by name, but still part of the tide, still carried in the rhythm of history's ocean. And we're just more ripples, adding our own faint patterns. The unheard lullabies. Somewhere long ago, a lullaby was sung in a language now lost. It soothed a royal child. It soothed a peasant child. It soothed a child whose name no one remembers. The lullaby itself has vanished, but maybe its rhythm still exists in the air, carried forward, reshaped, disguised as something new. That's how history lingers, not in monuments, but in echoes, drifting further. By now, the story barely needs words. The images themselves carry it. Shadows moving, waves folding. A soft song half remembered. Nothing urgent, nothing sharp. Just the slow comfort of continuity. The final rocking. So let's return one last time to the cradle. Rocking gently. Always gently. Not to prepare for kingship. Not to prepare for glory. Just rocking because rocking soothes, because rocking brings sleep. That's enough. A voice fading, and now the words themselves can fade the way a candle flickers out. You don't need to hold on. You don't need to remember any of this. The story has already done its work. It's only here to keep you company while you drift. And with that, the whisper lingers, soft, steady, unhurried, until you're gone into sleep. The endless drift, so we've reached the quietest place yet. No history now. No palaces, no names, just rhythm, just calm. If you're still listening, let the words be nothing more than background hum, like wind in the trees, like waves on a shore in the two. Room of stillness, picture, a room with soft shadows, a small fire, glows. The walls breathe with silence. You're safe here, you're warm here, nothing needs to happen. And the ocean breath, imagine. The sea, not crashing waves, not storms, just the endless breathing of water, in and out, in and out. Like the whole world is asleep beside you. The candle light. Now think of a candle flame. It flickers, it bends, it sways with the air, not in a hurry, not in danger, just alive, just glowing, until eventually it lowers itself into darkness. The gentle rocking. A cradle again. Always the cradle. Not a royal cradle, not an ordinary cradle. Just a cradle moving back and forth, back and forth, back and forth. Every motion slower than the last. Every sway deeper, heavier, quieter. Letting go at this point. You don't need the story anymore. You don't need the images. You don't need the words. They can float away, like leaves on a river, drifting, turning, vanishing downstream. All that remains is the rhythm, the hum beneath everything, the whisper that carries you into sleep. And maybe that's where we stop. Or maybe we never stop, because silence itself is the last story. The sound beneath. Silence, there's no story now, no names, no kings, no crowns. Just the rhythm that was always. For this time be breathing. Listen to your own breath. And out, in and out. Slow, heavy, safe. Like waves folding on the sand, like curtains moving in a night breeze. Nothing forced, nothing hurried. Just the body. Remembering rest. Heartbeat beneath. The breath is a heartbeat, steady, quiet, a small drum keeping time in the dark. Not loud, not sharp, just enough to remind you you're here. Each beat softer than the one before. Each beat carrying you further away. Rain now. Imagine rain, not a storm, not thunder, just a gentle shower tapping on a roof, drop after drop. Endless, safe and soothing, like the sky itself whispering you to sleep. Wind, and then the wind, moving through leaves, curling around corners, a voice without words, stretching across the night, not cold, not sharp, only a hand brushing softly against the world. The endless drift. All these sounds fold together, all breath and heartbeat, rain, wind, blurring, weaving, fading, until there's nothing left to follow. No beginning, no ending, only drift, only calm, only sleep. And if you're still awake, that's fine. The words will keep going. The sounds will keep flowing. But if you're gone already, that's fine too. The infinite night. We've drifted through palaces, through nurseries, through silence. Now there's only the night, and the night is endless. Could the ocean without end picture the sea? Dark, wide, calm. A wave rises, a wave falls, over and over, forever and forever. No beginning, no ending, just the sea. Breathing, and the sky of stars above it, a sky filled with stars, each one glowing, each one steady, each one farther away than you can imagine. They don't rush, they don't fade, they just shine to these silent companions watching, without watching. The fires glow closer now. Imagine a fire, not roaring, not blazing, just glowing. The wood cracks softly. The embers shift. The flame leans, then returns. Orange, gold, ash, and warm, steady, alive. A fire that doesn't end, only softens. The breath of the world, all of it together. The sea breathing, the stars shining, the fire glowing. And underneath, your own breath, in and out, in and out. You're part of it. You're folded into it. You're carried by it. The endless loop, and it repeats, always repeats. The Dior, sea again, the stars again, the fire again, the breath again, round and round, soft and endless, like rocking, like drifting, like sleep itself. No need for endings. There's no ending here, there. Never was. The story has dissolved. The words are only waves now. You don't need to listen. You don't need to hold on. Just let it continue. Let it blur. Let it carry you. The story that never needed a crown. We've spoken of palaces. We've spoken of nurseries. We've even let the words dissolve into silence. But maybe there's still one last story to tell. Not of kings or queens, not of crowns or thrones, but of something much smaller, much softer. A story that doesn't really have a beginning and doesn't really need an ending. A cottage by the sea. Imagine a cottage by the sea. It isn't large, it isn't grand. The roof is patched, the walls lean a little, the garden is untidy with herbs. But it stands year after year against the salt air and the wind. Inside lives a woman. Not a queen, not a noble, not anyone who will ever be written into a chronicle. Your is simply a caretaker of life. She knows how to stir a pot of soup slowly until the whole room smells of comfort. She knows how to mend torn cloth by lamplight, humming as she works. And she knows how to quiet a crying child by walking back and forth until the rhythm of her steps matches the rhythm of her breath. The rhythm of days. Her life is not recorded. No parchment keeps her secrets. No poet praises her hands, but her rhythm is steady. Morning, water drawn from the well. Afternoon, bread rising by the fire. Evening, the sea murmuring beyond the window, while she rocks a cradle. Each day looks like the one before. Each night folds into the next. Yet each moment is quietly necessary. The child who sleeps. And in that cradle is a child, not a prince, not a princess, just a child. The child doesn't know who holds the cradle steady, doesn't know the cost of milk or bread, doesn't know that the woman watching over them will never be remembered by history. But the child sleeps, and that is enough, because sometimes the most important role is simply to keep someone alive long enough to dream their own dreams. The great contrast. Think of it. In one palace, a prince sleeps while armies march outside his window. In another cottage, a child sleeps while waves lap the shore. One will be remembered. One will be forgotten. But in the hush of night, the difference feels small. Sleep is sleep. A cradle is a cradle. A hand on your back is a hand on your back. History may care about crowns, but comfort does not. A wider story. And maybe that's the real story here. Not about princes, not about dynasties, but about the countless unseen caretakers whose only kingdom was a small room with a sleeping child. The wet nurses of palaces, the mothers of cottages, the women who kept the rhythm of breath and milk, rocking and waiting, unseen. They were never given titles, but they were the foundation of everything. Every king, every queen, every soldier, every poet began in a cradle. And every cradle was tended by someone whose name was never written down, letting it fade. So when we imagine history, let's soften it. Not just battles and treaties, but fires in cottages. Not just kings, but caretakers. Not just glory, but silence. Because the truth is, history is made up mostly of people who never thought of themselves as part of it. They just lived. They just cared. They just kept the rhythm going. And maybe that's the story you can carry into sleep. Not the noise of thrones, but the hum of everyday life. A cradle rocking, a breath rising and falling, a cottage standing against the sea. Nothing more is needed. The tale of the endless lantern, fully expanded. Hey, welcome back if you drifted off and came back. Tonight's tale is small and slow and deliberately pointless in the best way. A fable with no lesson, no tidy ending, and no urgency. Think of it as a soft lamp left on in a narrow room. It exists to keep you company. That's all. The story begins and doesn't really need 2 wikes with a lantern. Not a magical lantern that grants wishes. Not a cursed lantern. Not a lantern with a particularly dramatic origin. Just a lantern that never seems to go out. People argued about where it started. Some swore an old woman in a cliffside hut first set the wick. Others said a child placed it in a cradle, and the flame learned how to calm itself. A few who liked to imagine deep things said the lantern had always been there like a small, patient star that had slipped down to earth for a closer view. Names are messy and history likes lists, but lists aren't invited here. The lantern moved. It was passed along not in a straight line, but in a quilt of small journeys. It traveled because hands carry what they can. It traveled because someone forgot it on a table, and someone else noticed the glow and took it home. It traveled because sometimes objects trust people more than people trust each other. First, it sat on the rail of a fishing boat. The fisherman would set it there at dawn while mending nets, and the light would make the ropes look like golden threads. He liked the way the small flame threw a soft pool of light onto the water, and he liked the way the sea accepted that light without asking for anything in return. At night, the fisherman told quiet stories, passing the lantern between them like a tiny moon, and the boat rocked and the flame listened and did not judge any of the tales. Then it went to a shepherd. The lantern hung from a low branch and watched the sheep doze in the grass. Kids, children of the shepherd, not the lambs, would place their ears against the lantern for no reason anyone ever explained. The elders just smiled and kept stirring their porridge. The lantern warmed clenched hands and made the field feel smaller in a comforting way. Someone carved a notch in the branch where the lantern hung, small and precise, like a punctuation mark in a long sentence of days. After that, it traveled along a road with a traveler who liked to walk at odd hours. The traveler had no destination that mattered. He carried the lantern like a companion, letting its light slip across signposts and stone markers. Sometimes he left the lantern outside a little inn and took a room unseen. Sometimes he left it outside a closed school and pretended it was a lantern for anyone who might be coming back. He treated the lantern as though it were polite, because politeness cost nothing, and it brought him the comfort of not being alone. Eventually the lantern was set in a palace, because stories like to visit palaces now and then. In the nursery it softened the echoing stone and made the shadows less threatening. The baby in the palace slept through the great noise of statecraft, because the lantern made the room patient. People in robes and with papers came and went, but the lantern stayed on a side table, patient and unbothered. A prince grew in that nursery. The lantern saw him from the first breath to the first stubborn night when he refused to sleep. The prince moved out, as princes do, to grand rooms with windows that let in an audience. The lantern was forgotten in a chest, tucked under linens left to its steady wick. Years later, a servant found the chest while looking for a lost glove. She dusted the lantern and carried it away. The servant did not consider the lantern political. She carried it because it fit into the crook of her arm, like an idea that had been waiting for someone to notice it. She left the palace with the lantern at her side, and that is how the lantern returned to smaller rooms and softer corners. From cottage to monastery to barn, the lantern went on. It lit the faces of lovers whispering against cold walls. It rested on tables during simple meals, where people passed bread in silence. It warmed numb hands at bedsides, keeping watch while someone breathed shallowly and someone else, quieter, recited fragments of a prayer. In one small place, a dying man insisted the lantern be close, as though the light itself would make leaving easier. The lantern did not make leaving easier. It simply glowed, and in that glow people found permission to be human in quiet ways. Sometimes the lantern moved by accident. A child would take it into the field and drop it under a hedge where a fox waited, thinking perhaps a lantern might be useful company. Sometimes the lantern was stolen, not for mischief, but because thieves are often lonely people who mistake taking for belonging. Most of the time, though, the lantern changed hands because someone noticed the light and thought, a little selfishly and a little tenderly, that perhaps they could use a small, unwavering glow. There are no great deeds attached to the lantern. It did not change the course of a war or broker a peace. If a treaty had been written under its light, that would be a nice sentence, and someone would have an anecdote to tell. But mostly the lantern lives in moments that refuse to be famous. A girl in a thatched house used it to read a letter from her brother, who'd gone to sea. An elderly man used it to mend a shoe, and then slept with his hand on the newly stitched leather. A midwife used it to steady the hand that tied a knot, and then hummed a tune that no one else could remember. Small rhythms keep the lantern company. The lantern keeps them company in turn. People began to attach small superstitions to it, as people do. Someone would say with a conspiratorial tone that the lantern saved marriages because it made arguments feel lighter the next morning. Another swore that if you set the lantern on a windowsill, you could see the road your life might have taken, as if light were a map and regret had a way of bending toward any glow. None of these became the truth, because the lantern upheld no truths. It offered only enough light to read a line or find a sock. In a village that liked to keep records, the lantern was mentioned once in a ledger, the way you might jot down the name of a neighbor who borrowed milk. Lantern returned to House of M after 3 nights. Someone wrote in neat handwriting. That line made the lantern feel like property for one fleeting moment, which was unfair but not unusual. Later, in a parish register, someone noted that Mrs. H died with the helpful lantern beside her bed. In that glance of detail, you can see how small objects gather histories, not heroic, but honest. It is important, or perhaps not important at all, and that is the point, that the lantern did not belong to any single kind of person. It hovered across boundaries people liked to erect. It shone in places of worship and in the elbows of taverns. It rested on the headpiece of a bride and on the sail of a small boat. It was useless for scoring victory, winked at music and prayers equally, and showed the same blue in the eyes of a child and a thief. If you are looking for patterns, the pattern is only this. It made life softer, and in doing so refused to become a symbol of anything more than company. One winter, a storm took the roofs from half a town. People slept with blankets tied tight and roofs leaking in slow drips. Someone collected what they could carry. The lantern was bundled into the arms of a woman who had lost all else. She carried it through streets where neighbors helped neighbors without press releases, where bread changed hands with no questions asked. The lantern shone through that week and the next, a modest dome of light in a scene otherwise full of damp and tired faces. No one crowned it with ceremonies. It just did its work. At the edge of the story, there is always a question about whether the lantern can be extinguished. If it went out once, no one remembers the hour. Folklore filled in tidy endings. Some claimed that the lantern could be put out by a kind word or a cold betrayal, that its flame answered to the weight of the human heart. There were other versions, that to blow it out was to blaspheme against mercy, or that covering it would be like holding your breath in a room where someone needed to breathe. None of these mattered much because it kept burning. That in itself was enough to frustrate moralists who demand that objects teach lessons. When the lantern finds a home where a child grows, sometimes the child learns to pass it on. That's the banal kernel of the whole thing, passing along what steadies you. You take what helped you through a night, and you give it to someone who might need a night. It is not noble. It is not heroic. It is simply human. As years unwound fully and people got better at making lamps and more reliable lights, the world made space for things that did a similar job, and stories moved on. But you can still find the lantern if you look in slow places. You can see it in the gesture of leaving a porch light for someone returning late, in the dim reading lamp on a bedside table, in the soft glow of a phone someone leaves on low beside a sleeping child. The forms changed. The function did not. And here's a gentle thought for the end of this smaller than a story. The world does not always need grand acts, and neither does it need final moral. Sometimes keeping something lit for someone else is enough. The lantern, which never demanded more than a hand to carry it and a place to sit, is the picture of that modest duty. No speeches, no monuments, just a light that continues, so the lantern keeps shining. Perhaps it sits in a farmhouse attic, or perhaps you will dream it tonight, tucked into the corner of a room you used to know. Maybe a neighbor you cannot place will come by and set it on your table, and you will nod and lift a hand, and the lantern will sit there as though it had always been yours. Maybe you will forget it the way people forget umbrellas and lose keys, and the lantern will be found again by a child who will pass it along in a few years. The loop will continue, unremarked, patient, like a breath. This tale has no tidy lesson. It asks nothing of you. It does not try to be useful. It simply echoes a small idea, that light, when shared, has a way of keeping things possible, And that possibility is not always about glory. It is about the quiet business of staying warm. Now let the image fade. The lantern sits. The wick is steady. The light dims slightly and holds. You might picture the flame leaning into the air and drawing back, patient as breath. The room is gentle. The world is not asking much. That is the cradle of the story. Not large, not loud, just enough to let sleep come. The road that had no turning, hey again. You're still here. Or maybe you've drifted in and out and back again. Either way, welcome. Tonight we'll wander a little further. This time into a road that goes on and on. It's not a busy highway. It's not even a path with a destination. It's just a road, one that doesn't turn, one that never really stops, where the road begins. No one knows exactly where the road begins, but everyone likes to pretend they do. Some say it starts at the edge of a forest, where the trees grow so thick you can barely see the sky. Others whisper it begins in the middle of a desert, rising out of sand dunes like a ribbon of stone left by some absent-minded god. And a few insist the road doesn't begin anywhere at all. It's just always there, stretching quietly underfoot, waiting to be noticed. Wherever it begins, it is always straight. Perfectly straight. Not a curve, not a bend, not even a small stumble where the ground shifts. Just one long unbroken line that melts into the horizon. Who walks the road? People walk it, of course. They always do. Some out of curiosity, others out of boredom, and a few because they have nowhere else left to go. A traveler might step onto the road at dawn, thinking they'll walk for an hour, and by nightfall they're still walking, still seeing the same view. Sky above, road below, horizon ahead. Sometimes they turn around, but when they do, it looks exactly the same behind them. The horizon repeats itself, like an old song on a loop. Merchants have tried to set up stalls along the road. They put out jars of water, dried fruit, and the odd trinket for sale. But customers rarely come. The merchants wait a few days, maybe a week, then pack up and leave. The road doesn't like commerce. It prefers silence. Children chase each other on it, their laughter echoing far longer than it should. Lovers walk it hand in hand, and after a while they forget whether they are going forward or back. Hermits sometimes sit on the road with their eyes closed, saying they feel the earth humming beneath the stones. No one argues with them. Things that happen on the road. Little things happen on the road. Quiet, ordinary things. Once a cart lost a wheel. The driver sighed, sat down beside it, and shared bread with a stranger who happened to pass by. They ate. They spoke very little, and when the stranger left, the wheel was suddenly fixed. No one ever explained why. Another time, a group of children drew chalk shapes across the road, suns, stars, birds, and clumsy flowers. The next day, the shapes were still there, untouched by rain or wind. Years later, travelers still said they could see faint outlines of those chalk drawings, glowing slightly at dusk. And sometimes, very rarely, people say they meet someone else on the road who looks exactly like them. A reflection, walking at the same pace, heading the opposite direction. The two pass each other without a word. When they look back, only one figure remains. The road at night. At night, the road does not disappear. It glows faintly, as if the stones themselves have soaked in moonlight. Owls perch on the edges and foxes trot across it without fear. Travelers lie down on the stones and use their packs as pillows. They say the road is the most comfortable bed they've ever known, not soft but steady. Some dream of reaching the end of the road. In their sleep they see gates, towers, fields of silver grass. But when they wake, the horizon is still just the horizon, where the road ends. Of course, the question is always the same. Where does it end? Stories multiply. Some say it leads to the sea, where the waves break forever against the last stone. Others say it climbs into the clouds, vanishing into air too thin to breathe, and a few insist it never ends at all, that walking it forever simply brings you back to where you began, though you don't notice the circle. No one has ever proven any of these. But then, proving things isn't really the road's purpose, a road that asks nothing. The road doesn't demand anything. It doesn't ask for tolls or offer rewards. It doesn't care how far you walk or how long you stay. It simply exists, steady and unbroken, waiting for footsteps or silence or the slow passing of clouds overhead. Maybe the road is not a mystery to be solved. Maybe it is just there, like breath, like heartbeat, like sleep, a path for wandering thoughts, stretching out endlessly, comforting because it never needs to end. So if you find yourself dreaming tonight, and the dream grows long and quiet, you may step onto a road that goes on and on. No turning, no stopping, no hurry. Just the horizon in front of you, steady and endless until you fade gently into the dark. The tree that remembered everything. Hey again. Tonight we're not walking roads or chasing lanterns. Tonight we're standing still, very still, because this is the story of a tree that remembered everything. Not most things, not the important things, everything. Where the tree stood. The tree grew in a field that wasn't special. Not near a palace, not on a holy hill, not beside a famous river. Just a field, the kind of field you'd pass without noticing. Flat earth, a little grass, a few stones, and in the middle the tree, tall, yes, old, yes, but nothing about its bark or branches shouted for attention. It wasn't the tallest tree in the world. It didn't bloom with magical fruit. It didn't even look particularly healthy some seasons. But people came to it because somehow they knew. The tree remembered. What the tree remembered. The tree remembered the day a boy dropped his toy at its roots. A carved wooden horse left behind when the boy's mother called him home. The tree remembered the way the horse lay in the dirt, soaking up rain, until one day it sank beneath the soil. The tree remembered the first kiss of two shepherds who met under its branches. They whispered to each other, thinking no one could hear, but the tree heard. It remembered their breath, their laughter, the way their hands trembled. The tree remembered the footsteps of soldiers marching past, armor clinking, faces grim. It remembered the horse that refused to move, and the way the rider cursed under his breath. It remembered storms, not just thunder and rain, but the way the sky pressed low, the way small animals hid, the way the earth itself seemed to wait. The tree remembered every word spoken beneath it, every tear, every song, every silence, and it never forgot how people treated the tree. Some people loved the tree. They tied ribbons to its branches, whispered wishes into its bark, pressed their foreheads against it when no one was looking. Others ignored it, thinking it was just a tree, another bit of shade on a long walk. And a few feared it, because what kind of tree remembers everything? Who wants their secrets kept forever in wooden root? One woman struck the tree with an axe once. The blade chipped. The woman walked away, muttering. The tree did not bleed, it just remembered. The weight of memory. Of course, remembering everything is heavy. Imagine a single branch holding the laughter of 1,000 children. Imagine roots pressing into soil thick with heartbreak, betrayal, joy, songs, death. Sometimes the tree trembled in still air, not because of wind, because memory shook it, the way a body shakes with too much breath. But the tree never spoke. It had no mouth. Its memory was its silence. Strange things people said. Travelers invented stories, because people don't like mysteries left alone. Some said if you slept beneath the tree, you would dream of every moment it remembered all at once. Voices layered on voices, a flood of time too large to carry. Some said if you placed your hand on the bark long enough, the tree would give you one memory, not your own. A child's laughter, a stranger's grief, the sound of a horse in a storm. And some said that one day, when the world ended, the tree would still be standing, reciting everything it ever saw, so nothing would be lost. The tree at night. At night the tree was quiet, quieter than trees usually are. Animals gave it space. Owls perched on other branches, never this one. The stars seemed to hang a little further back, as though giving the tree room. And if you listened closely, not with your ears, but with that part of you that listens when you're almost asleep, you could almost hear the memories humming, a soft vibration like a string plucked far away. The tree with no ending. The tree has no story arc. It doesn't rise, it doesn't fall, it doesn't get chopped down and turned into a chair for a king. It simply stands. It remembers. That's all. It remembers the first person who touched it, the last person who will, and everyone in between. It remembers things too small for anyone else to care about. A pebble kicked by a boy in sandals, the sigh of a woman carrying water, the buzz of a fly circling too long. And maybe it remembers you too, now that you've heard about it. Maybe tonight, while you drift, the tree quietly adds you to its list, because the tree remembers everything. The river that never flowed the same way twice. Hey again. Tonight we sit by a river that refuses to be polite about being steady. It isn't dramatic. It isn't mythical in the loud way. It's quietly stubborn. Every morning it arranges itself a little differently, and then goes on about its business, as if that is the most ordinary thing in the world. Listen, we don't need a map. Maps are for people who like neat boxes. The river doesn't do boxes. It is a soft line in a landscape that wakes up new every day. The first thing to say is simple. The river moves. Not like a storm that rages and then calms, not like a flood that roars and ebbs. It moves as if it is deciding what to wear. One day it slips left past a stand of reeds. The next it curls right and tucks a little island of mud where there used to be bank. If a bridge is built, the river will in its mild way ask the bridge whether it plans to stay. The question is asked by shifting a foot of water. Sometimes the bridge answers by becoming a picnic table. Surveyors came once with ropes and chalk and solemn faces. They set up stakes and drew lines. They declared with the tone of certainty that the river ran due east for 3 miles. The river, which had heard of such declarations before, looked like water and politely took the other path that afternoon. The men went home with their notebooks. They returned the next week and found the same men they had seen the week before, only 2 fields over. The river had not been rude. It had simply reminded them that nature is not always interested in human conclusions. Farmers learn patience by living near that river. There is a particular family of farmers who have ploughed the same land for generations and who have moved the vegetable beds 3 times in a single lifetime because the river wanted a new corridor. They call it the river's mood. The phrase is said with a small resigned laugh, and then they plant again. When a field is lost, they do not make epic speeches. They mend fences, plant a new row, and talk about the weather. In the quiet of winter, they tell stories about the years when the river spent all summer closer to the orchard, and the apples were better for it. They say simple things like an old prayer. Water is clever. Water is patient. Children adore the river. They leave their toys on the bank, with the sort of trust that only children and the very brave possess. A carved boat the size of a fist becomes a small saga. A boy pushes it out one morning and runs home for a stick. When he returns, the boat is gone. He cries briefly and then forgets, because the river has already taken his toy to meet some duck or to travel past a new bend. Years later, he will stumble on that same boat wedged in a reed, crusted with mud. and he will remember the smallness of time and laugh at himself for having worried. The river keeps toys and returns them as if to say, "You were here once and also now." There are mills, and mills are stubborn in their own way. A wheel that once turned to grind grain can be abandoned overnight when the river decides to move. The miller will stand and look at the wheel and then at the river and say aloud, mostly to himself, "Well." Then he will find another work or trade the mill for a place where the current likes to pass. Sometimes the mill becomes a story. Children will come and run their hands along the silent paddles and imagine ghosts of flower dust still dancing. When the river comes back near that old mill, it is always a little different, as if to remind the village that change is a visitor that sometimes stays for a while. Merchants set up stalls along the bank once. They brought jars of honey, knitted caps, strange cheeses, and little trinkets that jingled. They waited for customers who rarely arrived in crowds. Travelers would pass, sometimes pausing for water, sometimes buying a jar of honey for a road snack. Merchants learned not to complain. They learned to fold their wares and move a few yards down the bank when the river sketched a new line. Their stalls became portable monuments to mild adaptability. The river did not scorn them. It merely offered a new view. There are the lovers too. People fall in love on those stones because everything looks more possible when water is rearranging itself at your feet. Two people sit on a bend where the river hums differently. The next day they come back and the river is not there. They laugh and search for their private water. Sometimes they promise to meet at the same bend forever, not understanding that forever is a shape water resists. Sometimes they simply take a walk and find a new place to swear a soft oath, and the river becomes the quiet witness to vows that are meant mostly for the two of them, and not for the sky or the surveyor. Old women sit and watch. They breathe and remember seasons in the face of the water that refuses to be the same. They speak to each other in low voices about how the moon used to look on the river when they were young. Their voices curl around the river like steam. If you listen, you can catch a name or a place that no one else in the village remembers anymore. These recollections are not big stories. They are small truths. This bend was good for catching fish. That bank once hosted a picnic where a cake was ruined by rain. Over there a child learned to swim and coughed up river water and lived to tell the tale. Memory and motion weave together in these quiet hands. Fishermen curse softly when the river moves. Nets that used to be full are empty for a spell. But then the river takes pity, or perhaps it simply forgets its small mischief, and returns a shoal of fish where nothing had been the day before. The nets fill and the men spit on their hands and begin again. There is a rhythm to that work that comforts them more than a map would. The water's unpredictability is a kind of conversation. You lose, you wait, you mend, you receive. The river gives lessons in being ready for nothing and for everything. There are, as all places have, a handful of people who study. They come with cameras and notes and instruments. They measure, they time, they make charts. They announce theories about seasonal melt, changes in bed sediment, beaver activity, and clandestine underground springs. The river listens. Sometimes their instruments register what they predict. Sometimes the river rearranges itself overnight, and the instruments look like toys. The scholars produce papers and present to one another in rooms lined with maps. The maps are fine things, but in the end the river keeps being water that moves as if it were trying on new clothes. Legends gather as quietly as moss. One is practical enough. Throw a pebble in the river and it will never settle in the same place twice. Children test this, delighted. Another is softer. The river carries whispers. If you lean over and say a secret into the current, the sound will be carried until it finds the ears of someone who needs to hear something kind. People smile when they admit this. None of these are laws. They are small consolations, invented to coax comfort from uncertainty. Seasons shape the river's personality like a slow hand. Spring brings the melt and the river grows brazen. It explores new floodplains and sometimes leaves a field sullen and sodden. Summer dries parts of it to a thin silver ribbon. Autumn brings leaves that the river collects like postcards from the trees, and the water becomes a slow film of color. Winter stiffens the surface. The river will sleep in sections, glassy as if trying on the sky's reflection. Each season asks different things of the people who live beside it. They respond by altering their planting and harvesting, by tying up boats, by speaking quietly about last year's floods and last year's bounty. At night, the river thinks in a voice of reflections. Moonlight makes a geometry that doesn't translate to daylight. The water becomes a rolling mirror filled with stars and the shadows of clouds. Sound travels differently then. Footfalls along the bank are made long and thoughtful. The river's voice is louder at night, not in volume but in presence. Lovers listen. Drunk men lean and hum songs. Dogs pad at the edge and stare as if the river were a living thing that might answer them. Sometimes the river appears to move with intention, fishing for memories in people who sit too long in the dark. There are lonely structures left by human hope, a stone bridge abandoned when the river went elsewhere, a short jetty that now stands over grass, a faded signpost pointing toward water that is no longer there. These objects have humor. They become picnic tables, children's forts, backgrounds for photographs. A bridge that spans grass is a fine place to lie on a summer afternoon and imagine what it felt like when wood floated under your feet. These relics do not sulk. They adapt to their new purpose and allow the village to rearrange its own memory with gentleness. Sometimes whisper soft, the river seems to respond to the city's small tragedies. If a wedding is ruined by rain, the river might be still for a week. If a child disappears from a market and then is found safe at a neighbor's, the river seems to run more placidly for a month. This is not superstition entirely. What I mean is simpler and less decisive. People notice when the world around them shifts tone and they project pattern onto the water. Meaning-making is a human habit. The river does not mind being a canvas.